Hello everyone, lovely to see some familiar names on screen, if not faces. Thanks for joining us for the conversation today. As I think most of you know, I'm Vikki McInnes. I occupy a bunch of different roles within the University of Melbourne and also within the broader art community, and one of those is within COVA, the Centre of Visual Art, where I'm a research development fellow, and that's the role, I guess, that I'm sitting here today. Before I introduce the panellists and get underway, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm sitting here on Aboriginal land, the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and the Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation in my case. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and through them to any and all First Nations people who are joining us today. As the title of this discussion suggests, the broad subject today is resilience, and we'll be looking at that idea from a variety of positions and contexts. When I first invited the participants who are gathered here in the Zoom room, directors and curators from COVA's partner visual arts organisations, I noted my slight scepticism around the notion. And that's because it all too often seems that the ones called upon to be resilient are those who are most vulnerable or precarious to begin with. And if we're asking always the same individuals and communities to be resilient, I mean, clearly it's the systems themselves and the structures that require consideration and changing. I don't think we're going to solve the world's problems or even the art world's problems today, although this group gathered could probably go quite a long way in that regard. But it's definitely one of the starting points for the conversation. I was interested to question how this idea, at this particular moment in time, I guess, might be resonating through us as artists, as arts workers, as practitioners. And to consider how arts organisations in particular might act as agents or even accomplices to artists at this moment in time. And then further to ask whether or not this is even possible or desirable, maybe. So deeply appreciative of the colleagues that are gathered here today. Melissa Keys, Curator, Buxton Contemporary; Pippa Dickson, Director, Asialink Arts; Max Delany, Artistic Director and CEO of the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art; Simon Maidment, Senior Curator of Contemporary Art, National Gallery, Victoria; and Rose Hiscock, Director of Museums and Collections at the University of Melbourne and Director of Science Gallery. They've all agreed to participate today, and I'm especially grateful, as I know for each of them, this time has not necessarily represented a time of slowing down at all, and in fact, the complete opposite in most cases. So I'm very appreciative of everyone's time. So I've asked each of these remarkable guests, to respond to a question or a provocation, which I'll pose sequentially and then open up for a general discussion. And on that, I'm leaving my chat open. In fact, I'm opening my chat now. So please send me any questions either as they occur to you or as we go. I will save the questions and discussions until the end of the brief presentations. And on that point, I'd really like to thank and acknowledge my colleague Eleanor Simcoe for her terrific logistics and beyond, and in this event and all COVA's events, and also Susie Fraser for ongoing support. So we'll get going. And the first, I guess, question is to you, Melissa Keys. And we know that artists' lives and contexts are often precarious, but I wonder if you would discuss how artists are particularly respond to times of uncertainty. And obviously we're in the midst of one of those, a deeply significant one at the moment, but particularly with respect to your own curatorial practice.
Oh, thank you, Vikki. I'll just share my screen. There we go. Okay, well, thank you, Vikki. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are variously gathered today and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. Firstly, thank you for the invitation to join this panel alongside such distinguished colleagues, and especially for the opportunity to engage COVA, the university community and wider community participating in this forum. Today I'm going to briefly mention a small sample of initiatives individual local artists have undertaken to navigate the historic disruption that the COVID-19 pandemic represents. I'll make some general observations about wider responses to the changed environment, and then briefly outline my curatorial practice has shifted in relation to programs at Buxton Contemporary. Jochen Volz, the German-born director of the Sao Paulo Art Museum, has observed, "Art has always played on the unknown. Historically, it has insisted on a vocabulary that describes mystery and that quantifies uncertainty. Information is lost and doubt persists, but art can moderate such paradoxes by creating new systems, scales and standards, introducing alternative patterns and measures. Art dwells on the incapacity of existing means to describe the system we are part of. It points to its disorder. Most importantly, art can do this because it naturally joins thinking with doing with reflection." It's a truism and cliche that adaptability and resistance are part of the DNA of artists, and that artists are often inherently entrepreneurial. Throughout the pandemic crisis, we have seen countless examples of resilience and resourcefulness across societies globally, including from visual and performing artists who have been notably amongst the most generous and positive members of our communities. Ideally, in my opinion, this duty of care flows both ways. Society, governments, the public and private cultural ecosystems have in many senses obligations to recognise and support creativity and reciprocate this exchange. As a curator, I've always been motivated by and interested in the genesis of the term curator, which comes from the word care. At the heart of a curator's role lies the responsibility and impetus to enable, facilitate and support artists to pursue creative practice throughout all stages of their careers and their lives. I believe that curators, especially those in roles within public institutions, have responsibilities with varying levels of scope to enable artists through active research, publishing, exhibition making, writing and other forms of public engagement to bring artists into dialogue with the broadest possible audiences and communities. Public institutions such as art museums, galleries and universities each play catalytic roles in resourcing and disseminating contemporary culture, and these responsibilities are both practical and aspirational in nature. Over recent months, the pandemic has jolted the contemporary art world, and we have all had to adapt our approach to find new ways to enable and support artists to continue to make, sustain themselves, develop their practices, and share their ideas and creative outputs. It's important that the sector not lose its focus and that curators and institutions find ways and the means to facilitate and enable artists to realise their practice and to engage audiences and maintain critical communities intact. In this dynamic context, both artists and institutions have had to adapt their approaches, and we all remain deeply concerned about the potentially adverse impacts of the current global circumstances may have, while at the same time we are ready to identify new opportunities that may emerge from the always changing and complex ecology of the art world, both locally and globally. Most visibly, adapting these approaches has sparked and accelerated diverse forms of digital experiences, gatherings and panel discussions like this one, online exhibitions, studio visits, walkthroughs, performances, and newly created and commissioned digital projects. In my observation and experience, many artists adjust to new or restrictive circumstances by finding different ways to explore the ideas and forms of culture that have always interested them and that stimulate and nourish their creative thinking. Creative practice is by necessity opportunistic, using circumstances and conditions as vehicles for ingenuity. And while there continues to be focus on distributed digital activity, commentators have also observed a global resurgence in mail art. There we go. The sharing of physical artworks through postal systems as a way of creating connections in isolation. These physical artworks often also have some kind of online presence. An example of this can also be found in Melbourne-based artist Sarah Crowe's ongoing Use Cloth project. Sarah is well known for her strap-on paintings and more recently for her textile-based performances. Her textile forms come with a repair guarantee that lasts for 30 years or until the time of her death, which is quite the commitment. Sarah's project and broader practice often allude to systems of value, community, responsibility, devotion to making and social care. Her recent used cloth project comprises small squares of cloth that are presented or sent by the mail by the artist to people she enjoys or admires. To date, Sarah has circulated over 200 swatches of cloth. The works are distributed as gifts and she expects nothing in return. However, Sarah does request a photograph, which she may or may not choose to post on social media, but of course it's not necessary to comply with this request. The squares of fabric are numbered sequentially in the order that they are made and distributed. The project emerged towards the end of 2019 when Sarah decided to recycle all of the materials that had accumulated in her studio over a number of sustained years of art making. Materials such as residual linen, paintings, hangings, aprons, clothes, woven labels and printing ink. It's a project that is both economically and ecologically driven. The distribution of the squares contributes to what the artist sees as a circuitous social space. It's a project that suits her personal, reclusive and introverted nature while providing contact with those she admires. It's also the perfect project for the current circumstances. Like many artists, her income generating casual work dried up suddenly due to COVID-19, and this project has allowed her to continue working in isolation without institutional support, funding or human interface. The recycled dimension of the project incorporates both textile materials and existing printing screens, fonts and words from previous projects. Another project that emerged directly as a response to the current circumstances is Patrick Pound's The Museum of There Not There, a new iteration or sequel to a component of his solo exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria, The Great Exhibition in 2017. The exhibition has been presented in the physical space at Station Gallery over the past few months. And for most of us, it's only been viewable online. Patrick's practice engages with representations of things you can't really see. And this project cleverly uses the peculiarity of the current circumstances to extend upon that idea and to further explore notions of presence or absence. Patrick's museum contains a constellation of objects, a portrait of a family whose heads have been cropped out, a commemorative jug for a royal occasion that never took place, a scale model of a missing plane, coins from a cancelled currency, a VHS videotape of Titanic, a ghost image of an ejector seat, a snow dome of a long demolished stadium, a mourning brooch, an erased drawing, a cancelled library book, and an envelope stamped "Return to Sender," all presented within an exhibition that you cannot visit. According to Patrick, the Museum of There Not There is full of things that make the absent present and the present absent. It's full of apparitions and disappearing acts. Every representation is, after all, something of a conjurer's trick. As mentioned, museums across the world are currently looking for ways to continue to engage with artists and audiences through online and digital programming. We're keen to do this at Buxton Contemporary too, and I'm especially keen to find meaningful ways to commission and develop new artworks and content with artists that can be presented online and via digital channels, but that may also have a physical life outside of the digital space at a later date. Light Source is a new series of commissions that I'm currently curating as part of Buxton Contemporary's expanded digital artistic program. It sits alongside Creative Cosmos, which is an ongoing series of conversations exploring local and global contemporary art and seeks to profile selected artists by publishing focused interviews and accompanying images. These conversations are published on the Buxton Contemporary website, shared via email and social media channels. The first conversation was with Marco Fusinato, which was distributed in early April, and the second Creative Cosmos interview with Kushana Bush is to be distributed later this week. And I'm hopeful that this initiative will continue beyond the temporary closure of the museum with monthly conversations into the future. Under the title Light Source Commissions at Buxton Contemporary, we're aiming to commission and support and develop up to 6 new projects. The initiative's title, Light Source, refers to art as a source of illumination. The participating artists have been invited to produce ambitious projects that will be presented virtually or that have an online dimension of some kind. Potentially, these projects could have a later life in a gallery context, but for the moment, our focus is on the digital environment. Melbourne artist Stuart Holt is the first commission to be presented. As I'm sure you're aware, Stuart is a widely admired artist whose work takes numerous forms, including performance, video drawings, collage, sculpture, collaborative workshops and nude tours and discos. Social themes such as fear and embarrassment are often represented through nonsensical situations or amateur self-help environments. Again, for this initiative, Stuart's project is performative and participative for audiences. However, this event is to take place in people's homes. Stuart is an incisive and often humorous conceptual artist with an absurdist bent. In this instance, his work comprises a series of instructions and materials that are dispatched to participants who will register via the Buxton Contemporary website and then receive the instructions and materials via post. So yet again, it's an example of the resurgent interest in mail art and artists exploring different ways to connect. Notionally, the participants then undertake a series of actions safely within their home that centre around the contemplation of a large-scale paper monochrome while nude, either alone or with other members of the household. And as social distancing relaxes, one could potentially view it nude with a neighbour and eventually a mass gathering if one wishes. Participants are encouraged to share their experience by Instagram, which amplifies the reach and the ironic impact of the work. Like many artists, Stuart has had various projects around the world either postponed or cancelled due to the COVID-19, so the opportunity to develop this project was well received. Following Stuart, Larissa Kosloff is also developing a project that will comprise a short, humorous film made entirely from purchased online stock footage. The film will be around 5 minutes in duration and tell a story about frustrated climate scientists who create a new pathogen in an office pot plants that make corporate workers less productive. The narrative also involves corrupt politicians and a faked mission to Mars and explores themes of duplicity, neoliberalism and the climate crisis. Like many artists at the moment, Larissa and Stuart have been simultaneously homeschooling their children, teaching students online and working on their creative projects until late into the night. The historic events that have unfolded over the past months have added to the challenges faced by artists. Throughout, we have witnessed the generosity and resourcefulness of artists and many arts organisations who have moved quickly to adjust and adapt, often working under enormous pressures and organisational constraints to find ways to support artists in their practices. But I think we're all aware that there is a significant need for more. Needless to say, artists are often remarkably dedicated and make an essential contribution to the world. They not only demonstrate incredible resilience and adaptability, but they contribute to making societies more resilient, reflective and responsible. Artists explore alternative possibilities, challenge and provide critical perspectives, expand our thinking and spark our imaginations. It's a contribution that we should never take for granted, and I believe it warrants collective care and substantial government and institutional support. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Melissa, and thanks especially for raising the notion of care, which is obviously a critical touchstone in our, in our contemporary geopolitical context anyway, but particularly so at this moment. And I think that's probably something that we might talk about a little later specifically. And also for bringing Sarah's fantastic project to our attention. When I suggested to her that I'd like to pay for the cloth that she made for me, she wryly noted that Centrelink was paying for the postage of those works. So indeed, we find our avenues of support where we can. Of course, it's not only artists who navigate precarity, and the current moment's highlighted how perilous the existence of many of our arts organisations in Australia are right now. And it was interesting to see just this morning, New South Wales government announced another support package, although it seemed to be major arts organisations that were being referred to, at least in the article that I read. It'd be interesting to talk about how organisations themselves can survive in these times and continue to be generative. Asialink promotes the concept of thought leadership, Pippa Dickson, and I wonder if you might talk to how this concept is being applied during our current moment.
Thanks, Vikki, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for including me in the conversation today. And I actually wonder how we're all feeling right now, and whether everyone's feeling a little bit exhausted from the acrobatics of change, as I've been calling it. Today I have the privilege to be in Nipaluna, Hobart, Lutruwita, Tasmania, and I pay respect to some of the most resilient peoples in the world, the traditional and original owners of this land, the Muwinina people. And I acknowledge today's Tasmanian Aboriginal people who are the custodians of this land and all those who have passed before. I also pay my respects to the Wurundjeri people, the owners of the unceded land on which the Asialink offices are located, and to all First Nations people on whose land we work throughout the Asia Pacific. And excuse me, my husky voice, I'm not feeling 100%. So I'm going to read a little bit about what we're thinking and where we're heading at Asialink, because I think many in the room today might be thinking about us in terms of an old way of working that we have radically changed in the last 12 months and continue to radically change every week at the moment. And I would probably really welcome with Vikki's opening up. I'll cut this a little bit short and then we can have a discussion towards the end about the direct impacts on Asialink arts that we're experiencing at the moment as a small, independent ultimately, but associated and part of Melbourne University, but funded independently. So I'd like to start with a quote from a piece published only 4 days ago on the Asialink Insights part of our website by Dang Kam Tu, who's a PhD and Deputy Director General, the Institute for Foreign Policy and Strategic Studies at the Diplomatic Academy in Vietnam. He said, COVID-19 is leaving its imprint on almost all aspects of life. While the pandemic is not necessarily a game changer by itself, it is a reminder of pre-existing factors, trends, and values. It is also a catalyst for changes and shifts already expected to take place in the long term. COVID-19 has raised multiple cross-cutting questions involving several fundamental dynamics in the strategic and foreign policy environment. At the outset, there is the question of resilience at all levels, national, regional, and global. They go hand in hand. It's a reminder of interdependencies and connections which don't prevent us also from acting locally. In fact, I would argue that it is our values acted locally, our knowledges and actions that shape us and determine our value and success in our global relationships. It is at a local level that we successfully build our foundations for robust and sustainable structures. But it requires an interlacing of players, a complex meshwork, a totality of support and collaboration and cooperation, and robust advocates and confident governance. Exactly the system and conditions the small to medium art sectors must have in order to thrive. The future of Asialink arts has never been at the same time so precarious in terms of funding limitations and so thrilling in terms of its need. At the beginning of a new decade, the devastating impacts of Australia's bushfire season and COVID-19 have revealed the complex interdependencies of Australian and Asian communities in terms of health, well-being, economies, and social cohesion. We have most recently seen a wave of nationalistic thinking being revealed in acts of grossly unacceptable racist attacks. Across the arts sector, we see more and more artists and organisations playing integral roles in responding to this current environment of flux and providing the nuanced and deep thinking, the questions which will feed into regenerative efforts, building an inclusive and sustainable future. And I want to just give you a quote from an artist, and, you know, let's face it, let's be grateful that we didn't have 40 or say 10 to 20 artists at the first quarter of this year throughout the Asian region when COVID-19 border controls came in, but we did have one. Amy Parisian Capone for the West Australian artists was in Taipei at the Taipei Artist Village. And she quoted to us, "Some aspects of my original objectives were made impossible or more difficult by timeframes in COVID-19 pandemic, or simply less or more relevant in light of this profound and all-pervasive situation. As a phenomena that shadowed the residency time from the beginning and being almost the only topic of any conversation, I felt a refocus was necessary. Rather than materially engaging with communications technology and industrial processes, I found that it was more the original theme of the profound interconnectedness of people, technology, anxiety, and hope that was going to be relevant to my residency. Last year, as I indicated earlier, we set about redevising and I guess, redevising and redesigning our strategic direction as an organisation. So I just wanted to recap that Asialink is now in its 30th year. It was established in 1990 as a joint initiative of the Australian Government's Commission for the Future, the Maya Foundation, and is hosted at the University of Melbourne. We work to develop insights, capabilities and connections through our programs in 4 different areas: arts, business, diplomacy and education. And I just say this because many people in the arts just assume that it's Asialink Arts, but actually we're part of a much bigger group. And we are, in fact, with diplomacy, the smallest programs. We work with diverse communities in Australia and Asia to bring a strong shared future for all. And in the arts program, we have over 1,000 alumni across Australia and Asia with expertise and experience and a network of collaborators and partners across the region. And this has yielded a unique point of difference in the breadth and depth of our insights, cultural capabilities and connections across the region. In our new directions, we aim to be a leading provider of services to support and extend artistic and cultural engagement between Australia and Asia, and to grow a network of long-lasting cultural bridges across the Indo-Pacific. And I also need to say we swap those Indo-Pacific out with Asia-Pacific and Asia quite regularly, depending on which geopolitical area we're working in actually, and demographics sometimes too. We work at a strategic level to shift existing negative paradigms that are barriers to our broader mission. And this informs our thought leadership work. Within Australia, Asialink initiates partnerships such as the Asian Australian Leadership Summit that have exposed the extent that Australian businesses and society can nurture and leverage Asian Australian cultural capability, expertise and relationships. And we need to better understand and respond to the cultural interests and preferences of diaspora communities, including international students. And this is increasingly being foregrounded, especially at state and local council level. Most recently, we have been co-commissioned with the Creative Victoria to investigate the cultural consumption trends and preferences of Chinese tertiary students in Melbourne and the strategies that arts and cultural organisations are taking or could take to better connect with this significant audience. And I'm, I guess, sad to say that this has been delayed slightly by COVID-19 and the severe impact on our international student community, but that research should be published very soon and we'll keep you up to date with that. During 2019, we critically examined our impact and we shared a draft strategic document widely, nationally and internationally for feedback, which expressed particular urgency for resilient and enduring models to support artistic exchange, business and discourse, as well as expanded networking and knowledge sharing opportunities. Artists and institutions around the country expressed strong demand for support to their growth and engagement with Asia by catalysing and strengthening mutually beneficial relationships, partnerships, exchange and collaboration with their counterparts in the region. And requests for our assistance have primarily been framed in terms of learning objectives, learning how to identify, approach and cultivate prospective collaborators, etc. And facilitating services models, I guess, is our focus, which will be responsive, agile and dynamic. I guess the big question in this environment right now is how has this changed? If we were to do our strategic review and consultation right now and not 12 months ago, what would be the feedback we would receive? I think it's quite evident that the resources, and Vikki, you just pointed to create New South Wales, resources are generally going to immediate concerns right now rather than very strategic, in my view. And when we talk about digitisation and digital tools, these are, in my mind, just tools. They're not the answer to the universe. And so one of our big questions at the moment is how do we continue to engage in the region that is now faced with the obstacle of reduced travel and the reduced cost to travel? And what happens to the the fleeting encounters, as I like to call them, with people when we're actually in place rather than connecting in very structured digital environments. So our remit at the moment remains the same around shepherding introductions and growing connections, and we're doing that digitally. Advising on markets and fostering institutional partnerships, which again, we're doing digitally. Connecting artists and arts institutions to opportunities, which of course we all know is happening on a large scale digitally. Creating platforms, for frank exchange on cultural, political and social contexts and issues of importance in the region, and advocating for increased investment in artistic exchange with the Indo-Pacific is one of our key drivers. It is certainly not very high on the agenda of any government right now, because there are just so many questions right in front of us here at home. But we think really at the moment it's more important than ever for us to drive that agenda. So moving forward, we're looking at blended models and seeding projects and ideas for post-pandemic world. While we all respond to significant global circumstances and there is a tendency to be inwardly focused, we continue to emphasise the importance of reflecting upon and analysing relations and collaborations across the region. To emerge in a stronger position, we need to double down on intercultural literacy and bring together expert voices to define the value of international engagement in 2020 and beyond. It's our job at Asialink to ensure that when conditions permit, there are enhanced opportunities in our Australia-Asia engagement across the arts and creative industries. And I think I'll leave it there, Vikki.
Thank you, Pippa. Gosh, a lot to take in there, but your term, the acrobatics of change, is certainly one that I think will resonate with most of us. And it's interesting to hear you speak in relation to the article, which some of you may have read, by Frances Morris, which was proposed by Max Delany, whom I'll introduce next. And, you know, she said the Tate Modern is known for its international reach, but it has from the start been grounded in its locality. And, you know, I think that's something that we're all very much bearing in mind at the moment. And I guess a nice segue, Max, into turning to you and asking, how can a public art gallery act as an agent in generating both discourse around but also practical responses to times of uncertainty? And I wonder if you might talk to the question of how institutions might engage diverse and often or sometimes disenfranchised communities and provide opportunities for collaboration, community and collectivity in this in these times.
Thanks a lot, Vikki, and good afternoon, everybody. And thanks a lot, COVA, for convening this conversation and for the invitation. And I also would like to acknowledge the Bunurong and Wurundjeri and Kulin nations and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'm just going to share my screen, if I may. How's that? Is that working?
It's not at the moment, but I might have a little bit of a lag.
Sorry. Share screen. Desktop.
Yeah, there we go.
Is that better?
That's it, yeah.
And if I do that, does that work?
Yeah. Now we have you in full screen mode. That's terrific.
Oh, so you've got pictures of Andrea Buttner?
Andrea Buttner, that's right.
Oh, cool. Excellent. So I thought I might start with this image of Andrea Buttner's Beggars series, which was from a show that we did at ACCA last year in 2016 called On Vulnerability and Doubt. And the series is a group of 9 woodblock prints, and they explore a whole series of philosophical and ethical questions and conundrums related to, for example, discourses of poverty and shame, the increasingly divisive positioning of us and them, and the denigration of the vulnerable, the outsider and the poor. But the prints also very much reflect on the relationship between art and economics, and between poverty and patronage. And in this sense, I think they're important images for our times, in which we might also see the figures in Buttner's series as images of artists and indeed arts organisations before their audiences and their patrons. Now it goes without saying, and it's already been very put eloquently by Melissa and Pippa, that the context of the pandemic has radically redrawn the cultural as well as the economic landscape, and it's placed the arts in a particularly precarious situation. And I think, following from Vikki, my view is also that rather than this being an aberration or an anomaly or some unprecedented situation, as we've often heard, COVID has simply magnified the deeply embedded vulnerability of the art sector in Australia, which has been in place for a long period of time. One only has to look to the recent cultural funding and policy scenarios, such as the outcome of the Australia Council's 4-year funding process, or the recent case of Carriage Works entering into voluntary administration, and the ineligibility of so many independent artists to qualify for the JobKeeper package, along with a seeming lack of interest or will to consider targeted support for the sector, to understand the strains and vulnerability that we do face as a sector. In the case of the Australia Council, the intention of the 4-year funding program was to strengthen the sector, to build capacity and sustainability in the longer term. The outcome was inevitably compromised by the challenges of COVID, but also by a longer standing problem of static and or inadequate funding for years to the Australia Council, exacerbated by the Brandis cuts in 2015, which has led to many organisations now struggling for survival in a time of crisis. So without any significant additional government support, neither reimbursement of the Brandis money nor a dedicated COVID-related stimulus package for the arts sector, the Australia Council's existing funding has simply had to be spread wider but thinner, which serves more as a stopgap measure than a strategic investment in the future sustainability of the sector and our creative communities. And as has been widely publicised, a significant number of organisations were not funded or have lost their funding, which has already led to existential questions of survival for many arts organisations. Whilst those that were successful were funded at considerably less than what they had been invited to apply for, which will inevitably diminish capacity over the period ahead when it will be needed more than ever. And as the Australia Council themselves noted in their media release, this is not business as usual for anyone, and arts organisations will need to adapt in order to weather these unprecedented times. So in the immediate term, this adaptation in ACCA's case has involved focusing our attention on support for artists, including honouring our existing commitments, developing initiatives such as the ACCA Open to support the production of new work through digital commissions, off-site projects, among other things, supporting our staff and casuals, many of whom are young artists and curators and future arts workers, dealing with the reality of recalibrating budgets and rescheduling programs, pivoting towards digital delivery and new commissions, education and public programs, being aware of resources, support structures and important initiatives such as the Arts Wellbeing Collective developed by Arts Centre Melbourne, liaising with colleagues, peak bodies, government agencies and philanthropic foundations, and working determinedly in solidarity and dialogue with artists and colleagues and cultural organisations to advocate for greater support for the cultural sector, which has been especially hard hit as a result of COVID closures, and exploring how we can work together through this period, but also importantly, how to recover or how to plan for the recovery stage in the future. So this idea of adaptation brings us to the question of resilience, which this forum seeks to address. Resilience suggests the capacity to withstand times of hardship and to recover, to bounce back into shape. And it certainly has been inspiring, as Pippa has also noted, to see the ways in which artists, arts workers and cultural organisations have already risen to the challenge of a national health emergency in ways that speak to their solidarity with other colleagues, with those who are more vulnerable, their complete commitment to the public good and to civic generosity. And this is also on the back of the bushfires and the extraordinary level of commitment earlier this year, and as well as creativity, generosity, and resourcefulness demonstrated by the arts community. But the term resilience also inevitably suggests a body under pressure and stress, or stress and duress, which is true of the art sector generally, and COVID has simply amplified this. So rather than resilience and resourcefulness, both of which are inevitable and necessary and already apparent in spades, as Vikki has mentioned, I'd love to see us as a community questioning the systematic precariousness involved in the art system, which is exacerbated in the context of the pandemic, and looking towards models of sustainability and capacity building so that artists and the cultural sector is no longer in a position of resilience in the face of hardship and stress and putting its hand out in times of shock and duress, but is instead in a position to thrive and set up for prosperity where the contribution of artists to our society is understood and valued and supported accordingly. That said, I fear that resilience and crisis will remain the status quo for the foreseeable future. And so as we grapple with the effects of COVID's radical disruption and the immediate questions of survival and recovery, we must also take the opportunity to turn our minds to the future, even in all its uncertainty, and to reset our priorities, to imagine what a different future might look like and what we want it to look like. What are the challenges and opportunities, and how can we plan for the cultivation of a strong and vibrant cultural sphere? So this is an image of Field Theory's installation called Final Visions, Bunker, from 2017. It's an installation of assorted survival food and equipment, which we've happily had on store at ACCA over the period of closure. But it was actually a project which was included in the exhibition Greater Together, curated by ACCA's senior curator, Annika Christensen. And the exhibition Greater Together was set against our period of great uncertainty, where political, environmental, and cultural divisions are creating real need to consider new ways of doing things and new ways of sharing knowledge and resources. Annika's exhibition posed the question of how to work better at a time when conventional wisdom has failed us. How might new thinking and technology create new ways for people to communicate and to organise? In short, how might we work better together, collectively, through collaboration, and how might we be greater together? The question of how we might work better collectively has been one of the questions that has occupied our thinking at ACCA in recent years. ACCA's role is to be a platform for artists, to invest in our cultural communities, to be a centre for the exchange of ideas, and to reflect, ideally to reflect and inspire positive change in people and communities. So in thinking about this mission, we've explored a shift away from more authorial modes of curatorial practice towards more collective and collaborative curatorial endeavours, encouraging diverse voices and cultural perspectives and reflexive experimental working methods. Increasingly, I think this will become especially important in the period ahead, we see our role not only as a centre for our own activities, but equally as a platform for others, giving voice to artists, working together with colleagues and audiences as collaborators to create meaningful participation, cultural belonging and exchange. Beyond the specifics of COVID, in the first two globalising decades of the 21st century, we have seen neoliberal economic policies, increasing economic precarity, threats to security from fundamentalism and populist politics, climate emergency, and now pandemic. So there has been lots of opportunity for resilience. In this time, we've also arguably seen a retreat of the public sphere and the encroachment of market-led models for cultural institutions, which must increasingly rely on corporate sponsorship, private philanthropy, commercial revenues, and entrepreneurialism as government funding continues to decline. As Tate director Frances Morris has recently observed, museums in the wake of COVID are newly vulnerable, working in conditions of extreme instability. She notes that we need to make sure we privilege what we really value, that we do things differently, and that as we move from survival to stability, we seize the opportunity to shift the way we work, the catalyst for change that Pippa mentioned. So in many respects, I think cultural institutions will need to argue for the value of public culture itself and the public value of what we do. We will need to establish a new strategic partnership and modes of collaboration and build new alliances with diverse communities and constituencies. It'll become increasingly important to open up our cultural institutions and consolidate our ideals of inclusion, access and diversity in the face of increasing intolerance of difference. And as a sector, we need to play a stronger and more articulate role as advocates and ambassadors to change the conversation. Arguably, we need to adopt what Nikos Papasiadis calls the collaborative production of the commons, the proposition that our respective publics are hailed as constituents and that our institutions might ideally be sites for social transformation. Our creative sector will be crucial to help rebuild and animate or reanimate communities in the wake of the social and economic shocks caused by the pandemic. We have an important role to play addressing art's relationship to wider social, cultural, and political issues. As a public gallery, we see it as our role to be a protagonist in generating discourse around important social, cultural, and political challenges of our time. The exhibition Sovereignty, for example, in 2016, was one recent project which was set against the backdrop of cultural, political, and historical debates related to questions of colonialism and decolonisation, as well as constitutional recognition, sovereignty, and treaty. Conceived as a platform for Indigenous community expression, Sovereignty adopted a collaborative curatorial structure with Paola Balla as co-curator and with a First Nations advisory group involving artists, cultural producers, and community members who acted as advisors, advocates, and ambassadors to ensure that the project was informed by Indigenous communities' knowledge and participation. The process of collaboration has been an especially rewarding one, bringing new knowledge and communities to ACCA and new ways of doing things. The exhibition subsequently led to the establishment of the Yalingwa Initiative, a 6-year project in collaboration with Tarawara Museum of Art and Creative Victoria, involving curatorial positions for First Nations curators, a series of 3 biennial exhibitions and artist fellowships, accompanied by an active program of community engagement, including talks, performances, forums, professional development programs, among other things. Hannah Presley, at the centre of the image here, was the inaugural curator, and her exhibition, A Lightness of Spirit, is the measure of happiness, has led to significant outcomes for the participating artists and for Hannah herself as curator. Unfinished Business, Perspectives on Art and Feminism, was another project which continued this quest to animate critical debates and cultural practices within contemporary art and society, and to engage with diverse communities to provide opportunities for collaboration, community, and collectivity. So it too was developed by a curatorial team of artists and curators across diverse generations and cultural contexts, and was accompanied by a series of academic, institutional, and community partnerships, collaborations, and alliances. And we're continuing to learn how rewarding and generative these partnerships and collaborations can be. In future, it will be incumbent on us to be more open as institutions, to be ecumenical, to become a platform for others, and to support those among us, independent artists, organisations, as well as members of the wider community who are most affected and most vulnerable. This will require structural change and investment at the level of governance, funding, programming, policy, action planning, and much else. We will need to experiment in new forms of partnership and community alliances. And we will need to rethink our models of exhibition and event. As Francis Morris also recently observed, quote, programs made with associate organisations often run counter to the exhibition model and are collaborative, co-produced, and activist, suggesting rich directions for the future. This is the challenge that we have set for ourselves with a new exhibition project to be developed over a 2-year period in the lead up to ACCA's summer season of 2021-22, called Who's a Fat Public Space? Explores critical ideas as to what constitutes public culture and to ask, who might it be for? The challenge for the exhibition, cultural institutions more generally, will be to engage and activate communities both within and beyond the art world as part of a wider project of civic engagement. Such an undertaking will take time and committed engagement with communities, and will demand that we critically grasp the imbrication of politics and art. And again, to quote Nikos Papassiadis, to engage these contexts as both a means to put pressure on existing institutions and the instituting of new modes of becoming public. So alongside ideals of collaboration and solidarity are principles of decentralisation and democratic decision-making. These will be the challenges for cultural institutions in the period ahead, how to truly realise collective cultural practices and experiences. Working with an assembly of artists, collaborators and partners, and informed by a number of workshops, think tanks and public projects over the next 18 months, a project such as Who's Afraid of Public Space is meaningfully organised according to a dispersed, distributed structure developed with collaborating partner organisations and community groups and artists to encourage a polyphonic and polycentric understanding of our increasingly complex public and cultural realm. So in conclusion, ACCA's fundamental purpose is to be a platform for artists to create new work and for this work to resonate and connect with diverse communities. Social distancing is the opposite of how we normally prefer to work. And in this sense, the pandemic has been a great test of our values, our protocols and institutional practices. Cultural organisations now operate within a context of considerably reduced funding in the immediate period with an as yet unknown longer term outlook. COVID has put many things into perspective. And in this sense, I think it is a reminder about pre-existing trends, but also a catalyst for change, as Pippa mentioned. As Francis Morris has suggested, the silver lining of this crisis for museums, and I would add for the cultural sector more generally, may be a more rapid descent from the temple on the hill model of the art museum to a more egalitarian, more open-ended and more participatory institution that can engage contemporary society in its full diversity. And added to this, I also hope that it might stimulate a move from ideals of resilience and resourcefulness to a situation of sustainability and structural change.
Thank you, Max. Gosh, while you were speaking, I had the axiom of a constructed world reverberating in my head, the really remarkable Australian, now European-based duo, and their exhortation to stay in groups, which you know, seems kind of ironic at this moment, but as you know, as you say, we need to look to the future as well as consider the present, and very much, you know, it's incumbent on all of us here to be advocating for the value of the arts at all times. Some of the issues you raised around economics and sustainability, you know, are very, very closely into the prompt that I was giving to Simon Maidment, and maybe some of that territory's covered. I realise we are running close on time as well, my meanderings along the way. Simon, given the still ongoing culture wars that are being waged in Australia, the visibility of artists is more critical than ever, and some of the, well, all of the panellists have discussed that at some point, but I wonder what you make of, following on from Max, some of the government responses, but also where you might see responsibility lying in these unfolding scenarios.
Thanks, Vikki, and thanks, esteemed colleagues. And I pay my respect to the Wurundjeri and the Boonwurrung of the Kulin Nation also. Thank you for the opportunity to think about what the larger responses, institutional responses might be. Certainly, it's not clear in the mandate of a state museum like the NGV's that that, you know, there's not necessarily, it's not clear what our responsibility would be to the artist community at a time like this. But of course, everyone feels a great duty regardless, and as part of that community to ensure the resilience of artists and yes, their visibility. And I thought in particular that was very much at risk within the framework of what we do, being now closed to the public, and probably one of, I would imagine, the last the visual arts presenting organisations in Victoria to be able to open because of the scale of the building and the complexity of all those things and how they relate to social distancing restrictions. So visibility was very much at the forefront of the mind of me and the contemporary art team and the contemporary design team too, when we started looking at how to assist that visibility for artists while we couldn't host talks or present exhibitions featuring their works or the collection we hold of their works. And so we've, in the meantime, been very active on various virtual and digital channels and trying to give our audiences as one stakeholder experiences of exhibitions that they can't see, many of whom might have bought tickets to come and see, but have subsequently not just had refunds, but hopefully some opportunities to learn more about those works through virtual tours and curators' tours and talks and things. But more to the point, starting to do things that are more informal, particularly for us, with artists, inviting artists who are in our collection with video works to introduce those video artworks with short to camera pieces recorded on their phones and posting those. And we've had hundreds of thousands of people watch Steve Carr's introduction and video work, Watermelons. Sean Gladwell's has just launched. We have about 12 more made and waiting to launch, and many more, which is going to be a great resource for people researching the collection in the future. But also to kind of make visible the kinds of conversations that curators and artists have, and do those as sort of virtual studio visits. So beaming in and checking in on artists, individuals who we have recently worked with or are working with, seeing how they're doing, what their working conditions are like for their art practice today under this lockdown condition. We're meeting with artists, designers. Mary Featherston is the candidate for Wednesday's talk. There's 6 p.m. on Wednesdays. But importantly, also, I think we have a responsibility to try and use whatever resources we have to hand that are financial to, in informal ways, boost that resilience. So each of the people participating in any of those social media activities are paid. They're paid approximately as much or a little bit more than they would if they were giving a floor talk with us at the museum to produce those materials or to participate. We've been doing quite a bit of quick, purchasing of artworks and design objects in the community using various delegations that we have available to us, and that sort of thing. In terms of some bigger, how it will shift, like as in response to Francis Morris's great text. I mean, I think there will be inevitably in Australia a shift towards the celebration of the local, which I think there's no bad part of that, and that being something that is, I don't think Australia needs to worry about itself in terms of being parochial in that sense anymore. And I've been liaising over the past week with colleagues and other organisations, including the newly formed Rising Festival, which was the former Melbourne International Arts Festival, and White Night being amalgamated and into a new festival, which Gideon Oberzanek and Hannah Fox are co-artistic directors of. And they went from being in a very precarious position recently to now having their future secured, but also in light of them not being able to present a festival this year. And we were hosting a number of things for nothing, and being a bit of a platform for them this coming year. Those things can't now happen because they've had to cancel this year's festival. They've managed to convince government to reallocate and also add to a funding model of an expression of interest process where artists across disciplines, including visual artists, contemporary artists, can apply for seed funding to create ambitious projects, and they've been speaking, you know, as mentors to people like Archangel in London along those lines, have managed to reallocate $2 million towards that fund. And I'd encourage anyone on this presentation who has an idea that they maybe have never been able to realise or couldn't imagine how that might happen because it might be too risky or difficult as an individual, to have a look at that funding, which closes in less than 2 weeks, that first round of expressions of interest. I think artists, for me, as I've, you know, Vikki and I, we've spoken, I think artists are already incredibly resilient. They, you know, manage to, I think, not, you know, they're under constant external force regardless, as the arts are in general. Funding's only one part of it. There's a kind of, you know, culture war going on, as you've mentioned. Max has made, for, you know, drawn a good picture of some of the issues at a federal government level, and we don't have an arts minister at the federal government level. In December last year, the arts portfolio was brought into the infrastructure, transport, regional development and communications portfolio. So art isn't even on that letterhead when that minister does send a missive out or a press release or anything else. And it's not only been rendered invisible, like, you know, artists are at risk too in these times when places of presentation are closed, but it's also been instrumentalized. So it's used for regional development. It's not celebrated in and of itself. And I sent that piece by Justin Clemens, Myth, Objection, Otherness, around for precisely this reason. And I won't read it because we're running out of time, but the last paragraph in that great text, I think articulates well that it's not just Senator Brandis and the Conservative government of Australia that is engaged in a culture war, but actively artists are also, and they are looking to redraw Australia and its national identity, and that is very much the opposite of what many Conservatives would like them to do. So that sense of kind of the clash is kind of happening, and I think we are somewhat kidding ourselves if we don't see it in that sense, that that this could potentially, this crisis could be used to continue the work of trying to squash grassroots and small organisations and also dissenting voices. But also it's an opportunity, and I think it's an opportunity in the sense that we will be looking to hopefully come out of this making some bigger decisions about the world that extend beyond money. And we all know about the ecological crisis that we've been facing, and also the ways in which in a very short period of time, nature and the planet have been recovering in incredible ways. And I'm sure we've all seen so much more bird life amongst everything else. And as part of that bigger government, federal kind of national understanding, which I think feeds into something Max was alluding to, but not saying specifically, the reuse, and Pippa too, understanding that the conditions that we're currently facing economically and in terms of labour and work in this country, this is not that unusual. It's actually preswages the future, and the future of work, and the future of precarity, which will be more broadly felt in the community than perhaps ever before. And certainly the artists and arts workers have already been feeling that for years. We're already among the most, in terms of the developed world, that have the most precarity within our workforce, you know, as an economy. And one way, and I think really in some ways the arts has been sleeping on this, you know, as advocates towards this, but I think there's from a political perspective, as much as an economic one, there's a real case to be made to begin advocacy around a kind of universal basic income model, one that a lot of writing has been happening as a, you know, to kind of place the qualities that might afford within society. So the introduction of a universal basic income improves the quality of life for the most disadvantaged people, and then a kind of slope up. It makes very little difference to billionaires. It makes an extraordinary amount of difference to people who are, you know, disabled, or who come from minority groups, or are stay-at-home mothers. There's been a lot of writing around the idea that this would finally create an understanding more broadly within culture that the work of housework and caring for children is an equal labour to that you do more formally in a job. But also, I'd say more, you know, helpful for our discussions as a community is thinking about this, that it also places the kind of it gives value to places greater value on the traditional roles played within Indigenous societies, and also then within the arts. And the arts is, you know, $110 billion industry a year in Australia in terms of what it gives back to the economy, more than. And yet we don't see the work of the culture makers as individuals, people who can't be unionised, people and people who aren't, as Max said, able to access things like JobSeeker because the work that they do isn't formalised. In this, you know, in an equally kind of valued position than as someone who's doing kind of a formal paid job for an employer. So I think there's a lot of work, a lot of advocacy at that kind of larger level, and actually what federal government should be turning their attention to. And it could be a way into and past the current conservative government culture war approach, and bring a whole lot of marginalised areas of kind of the labour force and non-labour force together. And I see kind of a role for all of us in potentially advocating for things like that.
Thank you, Simon, and thanks for bringing the concept of the universal basic income into the discussion as well, which I think certainly in relation to JobKeeper is a really salient one to be having, although probably not the time to so much time to have it as you know, as we need to. And thanks too for suggesting the Justin Clements text, and I really recommend anyone who hasn't read that, myth
Objection, otherness. Yep.
Thank you, otherness. All that was written 10 years ago. It's incredibly, you know, vital and timely. We are running behind time. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Rose Hiscock. And Rose, you're in a unique role as both director of the Science Gallery that's due to open next year, but also in a new institution. I'm wondering if you might be able to talk to that.
Thanks, Vikki. I thought I might make some comments of the moment and of the time and of the global pandemic that we're in, and that is to make comments that are both personal and global, because that's what we've been placed into, both intensely personal in the way we're living our lives and in our homes and in our spaces, and we're connected in a way that we've never been before. And where I want to land, I'll read a piece just around this notion of the arts from a personal and a global perspective. I want to show you something that the Science Gallery Network has been doing, and then I want to land on the concept of vulnerability, because I think there may be some keys in that for us. So every morning, the staff at one of the University of Melbourne's 15 museums and galleries, so we have 15 museums and galleries across the university. So every morning, the staff at one of them meet for their daily briefing. Online, obviously. The session starts with a new ritual inspired by a global pandemic. Some months ago, and long before COVID-19 forced the closure of museums and galleries around the world, the museum's head of finance inherited his late mother-in-law's collection of 127 Swarovski crystal figurines. Each day, the staff meeting commences with a theatrical unveiling of one object, and as penguins, elephants, mice, rabbits, labradors, tortoises emerge from shrouds of bubble wrap, to the delight of his colleagues, the head of finance provides a rather dry commentary to the team, who are used to handling a valuable art collection. And they stop for a moment of shared kitsch hilarity. For the cultural sector, COVID-19 brings a newfound sense of connection and intimacy. As we've retreated indoors, our living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, backyards and front porches have become makeshift backdrops, and conversations have moved from public to personal. For some art forms, such as theatre making, writing and music, emotional exposure is inherent in the art form. However, for others, such as curatorial and collecting institutions, we need to learn a new language of intimacy. Literary events and comedy festivals are particularly successful at achieving a simultaneous feeling of tribalism and intimacy. Earlier this year, I attended an evening with David Sedaris at the Victorian Arts Centre. Together with 2,500 audience members, I took delight in Sedaris's unique voice. He was funny, brilliant, albeit a distant speck on a faraway stage. The audience laughed as one, groaned at the embarrassing questions, and as we spilled out of the theatre, a queue was already forming, snaking through the foyer with patient fans lining up for their book to be signed. Sedaris famously stays until the last book is signed. After a 45-minute wait, my friend joined me at the bar, flushed with excitement from her 30 seconds with Sedaris and an ink scrawl on her book. 6 months later, and under the constraints of isolation, I bought a $15 ticket to join writer Colin McCann in conversation with Cara Llewellyn as part of Together Remotely, a newly launched online literary festival. I joined out of curiosity. Would an online conversation satisfy the tribe? At the allotted time, I logged on together with a bunch of strangers from around the world, including partners squeezed into one screen, young, old, sideways, some names only, a bunch of bedrooms, living rooms and people I'd never met. McCann, already online from his somewhat messy office in New York, was just another mini box on a screen. No theatrical entrance, no knock on his caravan. He just clicked online and emerged from the crowd when invited to speak. The session started with the obligatory Zoom etiquette. Can you hear me? Is my microphone on mute? And then McCann talked intimately to his computer and to us on the other side of the world, answering questions and reading from his latest novel. He felt accessible, homely, candid. He was visibly moved by his own story, and so were we. The experience was transformational. I felt like I was really with him, and I was. In a similar set of at-home experiences, MTC theatre director Sarah Goods has initiated an Instagram series called A Light in the Dark. The premise is simple. Actors and playwrights read a short passage, a play, a poem, spoken word from their homes with sparse lighting. As an audience member, the experience feels illicit. The actors are coy in their introductions and almost embarrassed at the end. They're not sure how to close. The sessions are excruciatingly intimate. As an audience member, we feel we've walked in on something, but we can't walk out. For collecting institutions, those of us who deal with objects and things, finding intimacy with objects is hard. We've created an extraordinary fourth wall between our objects and our audiences, and it's time to break it down. I think two things are going to enable us to break that wall down. The first is a sense of vulnerability, and the second is the notion of the collective. And I want to bring this to life by showing you a program that Science Gallery International got off the ground just recently, called the Science of Grief. So Science Gallery International is a network with 8 member nodes worldwide, all attached to leading universities. So from the US, Rotterdam, London, Dublin, Venice, and the network decided to do a global relay, and they chose grief as their topic. And the idea was that every venue would program an hour on the subject of grief, and it would go across the whole world as a relay. And they wanted to do it in sort of a 3-week period. 2 of our node members had already developed some subject on grief and had content that they felt that could be shared, and they had a safe framework to deal with the subject of grief. We felt we didn't in Melbourne. We didn't have, and from a First Nations perspective, the notion of grief is so deep that we felt we couldn't initiate a conversation without having cultural safety in place. So, but 3 of our network members did do this. They streamed the notion of grief. They streamed content on grief, and they followed each other up one after the other. And I'm just going to share you a piece from it now. Let me just grab this. Okay, so this is an Irish poet named Theo Hogan, and I thought it'd be nice to hear from an artist. Sorry, I've just realised I didn't hit my audio. Just let me stop doing this for a sec. Okay. That's ugly, hey? It's coming, people. Okay. So Theo, he's talking about grief, and I'm going to play just long enough for you to hear him read a poem. Theo started these 3 hours on the subject of grief from Dublin, and I'll just play.
And grief, as the poet says, is felt in the body. Grief makes its home in the body. And it was at a time I was newly in love, very much in love. And suddenly, for no particular reason, it occurred to me that one of us must die before the other. And it was the most piercing of sensations. You might think odd in the sense that I was at that moment as happy as I had ever been in my life. And through that happiness, like a spear, came the thought that one of us must die before the other. I suppose it's a sense of how frailty and value are bound up together, like 2 braids in a bracelet, you know, that what we value most is what we will miss most. But it was an extraordinary moment. But I was lucky in the sense that soon after that, a poem came to me that helped to resolve it, or at least contain it. And I thought that perhaps as a contribution to this conversation, I might say the poem. I might read that poem as a contribution. It's called Learning Death. I took the title shamelessly because bad poets borrow and good poets steal. I took the title from the very fine Irish language poet Nuala O'Connell. It was a beautiful poem called Ag Fólam an Bhás, Learning Death. So I just took the title, Learning Death. The first time I knew myself mortal, that unmistakable catch in the breath, we were new to each other still. I was stroking your face as you sank towards sleep and said without meaning to, call me if you need me over there. Full moonlight, the square white bedroom, your eyes startling open, aftershock in the cold air of what I had just said. The crackling electric thought we took, one breath between us, so close we lay. How matter of fact that was, how clear. And there we were, borne up on a void soundlessly opened, shy with each other, stricken all of a sudden to know time might contrive to part us against our will. I knew what mortal meant. You might call, and I would not be there for you. Grief worse than any I had felt my life until then. Now, facing the white blank of the page, that thought again, unbidden, there will be an end to words, an end to compact breath. You shaped my face in your hands. You said, you'll be there. I'll be there. And we slept. And it's an extraordinary thing, and I don't want to end.
I'll stop there. Now, I'm just going to fast forward this to show you. This thing went into nurses, doctors and nurses talking from their hospital. So one of our network nodes is in a hospital. So we had talking about COVID, and then an amazing spoken word piece from so this is a harpist in Detroit, and then this extraordinary spoken word piece from a spoken word writer whose sister had died from COVID the week before, and he was talking about the funeral. So this whole 3 hours of content is it's extraordinarily moving once you watch it from top to tail. It moves between artists, scientists, musicians, playwrights, poets, thinkers, academics, and it shows an extreme vulnerability across that program. So I think that the opportunity through this stage is for institutions to show their vulnerability. And I don't think we do it in the arts. I think we care about our institutional outcomes. We care about how important we are, how successful, how large our collection is, how important our donors, but we don't show our weaknesses. If there's one thing we can learn from artists, it's how to show our vulnerability.
Wow, thanks, Rose. And goodness, I feel like I'm about to cry. That poem was so beautiful. And again, along with the notion of care, vulnerability, and indeed grief, you know, they're very important touchstones at the moment. Something that has occurred to me, I guess, as we've, as everyone's been speaking, that we haven't gone into so deeply is the question of responsibility and unpacking that a little. And I guess the Derridian notion of responsibility, not just in terms of doing the right thing, but of having the capacity to, or the ability to respond, you know, breaking that word down into its most, you know, kind of basic level, the response ability. And, you know, that's something that today during all of these presentations has been really profound and very evident, as has the question of that I think each of you has raised from your own you know, organizational perspectives, the notion of returning to something, and whether or not that's, you know, a form or a mode, some sense of whatever normalcy is going to be for us beyond this time. But I guess we, you know, in order to, we have to, I guess, return to something before we can move forward, and that's been very evident. I was very adamant at the beginning that I was going to finish at 3:15. It's 3:25 now, and we've run out of time for questions and discussion, but I just wonder amongst the panelists if anyone did want to make a comment on, you know, as we kind of move out of the Zoom room, or if we're all happy to leave on that, you know, on that note. Poetry, I think, is maybe a nice way to, you know, to end the conversation. That
Vikki,
you know,
I just wanted to say before we finish, because I'm sure I'll be speaking for a lot of the panels here, and just to kind of acknowledge all the artists who might be listening to this and makers who are listening to this, and acknowledge that they, I'm sure, continue to work, think about their practice in perhaps new ways also, and looking forward to being able to assist you further, making the things that you are doing more visible, and just give my kind of thanks and acknowledgement for all of their, resilience through this period, because you're the most important part in my mind, and I'm sure everybody's here, is the community that we all work within. So thank you all, and I can't see you, but metaphorically we see you, so thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. Rose, someone has asked if there's a link to that presentation on the science of grief. Is that?
Yeah, I was just going to grab it. The quickest thing, if I don't do it before you jump off, is just Google Science of Grief Science Gallery International, and you'll find it. But in the meantime, I'll just jump online and grab that link.
Okay.
The other thing I should have given a plug to is if I'd had a little more time, I would have talked about the notion of the collective and the university's new Cultural Commons website that does bring together, which I think what Vikki, you had thought I would talk about, but I wanted to respond to the Times, which is our new website that brings together the whole of the university's museums and collections for the first time in a sassy kind of a way. So I'll pop a link to that too.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm sure people have... oh, there it is. Thank you. Okay, we'll leave things there with, I guess, a thought for us all as we, as we can to, return to the important things as we move forward into the next phase, and maybe as Pablo Larios advocated in one of the texts that Melissa proposed, also to kind of consciously withdraw from some of the activity that did exist pre-COVID as we move forward. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and to the really terrific panelists especially, thanks so much for your time. Bye everyone.